What are the two roots of conflict?
Very, very quickly, priorities or personality. When we're in conflict, we're either fighting for things that we think are important, or we are reacting to a part of ourselves that just got triggered by something we see in the other person. You can tell you're in a priorities conflict because your interpretation or reaction to it is very cerebral. You'll hear yourself saying things like, I don't get it. I don't understand. Why does he do blah, blah, blah? Or it doesn't make sense to me that she does whatever it is that you're reacting to. And those kinds of conflicts, those priorities conflicts, are relatively easy to work through. But the second type of conflict, the personality conflict, which is really you bumping into your shadow, those feel much more guttural. There's much more of a, oh, I just don't like that person. I don't know what it is about her or him. I just don't like that person. And so there's a different path that we need to go on to resolve a personality conflict.
I love how you describe it in these two parts of the human body, which is exactly what I personally experience as well. On the other hand, the mental, the cerebral capacity of someone to understand yourself and the other person, and then this bodily sensory feeling of understanding yourself or knowing even where something is coming from, your own shadows and traumas and all that stuff that sometimes can be so overbearing. Like, what kind of tools do you use in your work to help a client that might experience this ambiguity between those two? Is there even a way to align that in some way to navigate a conflict in a graceful way?
Yes, there absolutely is. And this is coming from someone who pretty much hated conflict growing up. Conflict was not allowed in our house. In fact, I grew up in a philosophy school where meditation and being peaceful was prized. I grew up with a father who couldn't stand emotional charge. So mom and dad never fought in front of us kids, right? So there was no role models for dealing with conflict, and a tremendous fear, actually, of conflict. So I've had to learn over the years that, yes, in fact, you can resolve conflicts with grace, not always with ease, but certainly with grace. And the tools that I used, coming back to your question, I listen a lot. Probably the most important thing that any of us can do in relationship is learn to really listen to the other person. And I'm listening for the words that the other person is saying. So again, we speak our wisdom, we speak our wisdom through our words. Sounds kind of obvious, but when we say, it doesn't make sense or I don't get it, like then you're looking at a priorities clash. And the way to resolve a priorities clash is to get really clear on what your priorities are and don't make yourself wrong for wanting what you want. Then you get clear on what the other person's priorities are, and you don't make them wrong for wanting what they want. And then you learn to communicate in a way that you speak your priorities in language that lands with their priorities so that you can actually hear each other. So listening through the lens of priorities is a tool to learn. Then if we're dealing with the personality clash, when you're really in a place of, I just hate that this person is so selfish or self-righteous, or that I just don't like something about that person, then the tool is we have to look in the mirror. We have to own the trait that we see in the other person, and we have to own it 100%, which means going back through our memory banks and recalling all the times when we or somebody else saw us exhibit that same personality trait that we're reacting to. And only when we can own something 100%, then the next stage is to understand function. Like, I truly believe we get to love through understanding function. So when we ask questions like, well, how did it serve me? that I was selfish? Or how did it serve me that somebody else was selfish? And we sit with the question, we walk it through all areas of life, and we keep asking that question until suddenly what arises in us is gratitude for that trait. And once we get to gratitude for that trait, we integrate the trait. And that gratitude and grace to me are the same thing. So when we have a moment of grace, or that moment of, oh my God, I'm so grateful that I have this part of me that is selfish or self-righteous or lustful or whatever it is, when we can get to that point of, I'm so grateful that I have this aspect in myself. And if we can get to, I'm so grateful that that person has that aspect or that trait in themselves, then all of our emotional charge around the trait collapses. That personality trait then becomes an ally within us. Nothing to react to anymore. Those are the two tools, two of the main tools: communication, learning to sell, in other words, speaking in terms of somebody else's priorities, and developing reflective consciousness that allows us to fall in love with the traits and characteristics of ourselves that we previously had not been loving.
I love how you put it. Let's dive deeper into an example, maybe, of priorities so that the audience might have a clear idea of how to actually put yourself in the position of the other to understand their priority.
I'm thinking of a client that I worked with. There was a couple, and the wife came to me. They had two small children, and she was so angry and frustrated because her husband worked 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, but then on the weekends he worked as a volunteer fireman. So he was gone from the home a lot. And she came in saying he should spend more time with us family members, me and the kids. He ought to, he's got to give them his attention. He ought to be doing things with them because they're going to grow up fast. He's going to miss out on this time. She had all her reasons. Now, what she was telling me was that her priorities were to be home with the kids, to go to activities with them, to spend time doing things as a family unit. Now, he had a different set of priorities. He was very much the breadwinner. So the working 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, was very much about providing for the family. But he also felt that in order to create a safe environment, he wanted to be a fireman. When I'm not in South Africa, I'm in Colorado, and our biggest threat is forest fires, right? It's because we live in the forest, in the mountains. So he thought that he was doing the right thing, being a good provider by working hard and spending time at the fire station as a volunteer fireman. So there's an example of if I use my hands to demonstrate the priorities that we have, the hierarchies of priorities, she had spending time with her family and doing activities with the kids as a very high priority. He didn't have the same priority to spend time with the kids. His priorities were somewhat different: work, make money, create a safe environment for the whole family to exist in. So here's her hierarchy, here's his, and they're inverted. And relationships work if there's enough of an overlap between wife and husband or two spouses' set of priorities, but conflict arises in the areas of life that are not in alignment. So if she wanted him to do the things that she wanted him to do, and we always know this is another sign of a priorities conflict, when we hear ourselves saying, you should not prioritize what you're prioritizing. You should prioritize what I'm prioritizing. And what we're really saying is, you should be like me, right? So if she wanted him to prioritize what she was prioritizing, she needed to become a very good salesperson and link his desire to create a safe community and be a respected member in the community that was also part of his value system. She was going to have to sell him, basically, on stopping putting so much time and energy and effort into what he thought was valuable and do the things that were her priority. So that's one strategy, is you become a very good salesperson and you learn to link what you think is important to what the other person is important. And if the other person can see that they're actually going to get more of the things that are priorities to them by doing what you want them to do, you're going to have a willing participant. But most of us are not very good salespeople. So another strategy, and this is the strategy that we worked with mostly, the other strategy is to ask the question, how does my partner's priorities help me do more of the things that are high priority to me? In other words, how does him being him help me enjoy more of what feels fulfilling and meaningful to me? And in this way, we can again, through that question of function, how does it serve me that he is who he is, that he does what he does? How does it serve me? What does it give me freedom to do or freedom from? Who does it connect me with or disconnect me from? If we answer those questions, what starts to emerge in us is gratitude. Gratitude to the other person for being who they are. And who doesn't want to be in a relationship where we feel appreciated for being who we are, as opposed to handpicked and harangued to be somebody different?
I absolutely rave about how you just described all of this. So many light bulbs are going off in my head right now because I kind of had to learn that the hard way. This kind of learn to understand the other person from their perspective and what they value, and then find a way to be thankful and grateful for who they are and how that can actually serve you to be a better person, to be a better mother, for example. Because let's be honest, in life we don't have quite much time, especially when it comes to raising kids or raising a family or even growing a healthy relationship. Time flies pretty fast, considering all the circumstances in which we live in, right? All the challenges that we have to face. And I think it will not serve us very well if we start fighting against our partners and against our kids and creating problems where there are no problems in reality, but just misconceptions in our own perception, if you will, right? That we don't see clearly what we have right in front of us. And my feeling tells me that there is a reason why, especially women, feel, and I was just that type of woman way back in the past, that felt so compelled to blame the man for not being there for the kids, not being there with me, for me, what have you, right? This entitlement of almost a possession type thinking, right? That his time belongs to me, right?
Yep.
Where do you believe comes that from?
If the victim archetype exists, then it must serve a function. I truly believe we live in an extraordinarily brilliant economic universe. And so if something exists, it serves a function. If it doesn't serve a function, it goes extinct. So if the victim archetype exists, it must serve a function. If blaming is a habit or a thing that people do, it must serve a function. And what I've come to see over the years is that one of the hidden magnetizers, if you like, of the victim archetype is that he or she can get a lot of sympathy, right? So when we go into victim mode, oh, poor me, we get a lot of people around us going, oh, poor you, let me give you my attention, let me give you, something to make you feel better, let me connect with you. So it can be a powerful way of drawing people to us in order to feel some sort of connection, right? So that's one of the sort of hidden functions, I think, of the victim mentality. The hidden benefit, if you like, of blame is that it protects the ego. If we do something that we don't really feel good about, and this starts when we're 2 years old, if not before. The 2-year-old knocks the vase over. He's the only little kid in the room, the person in the room, but he'll still blame somebody or something else. I didn't do it. Must have been the wind or something, right? And we do that because without blame, very often what we have to feel is shame. And shame, I think, is the hardest of all the energies or the emotions for us to feel. There's a paradox to it. It also gives rise to the entire human experience, but we can talk about that later. It is the most difficult emotion for us to feel. Guilt is one thing. Guilt is the perception we did something bad, and we can deal with guilt pretty easily by making amends. But shame is the feeling I am something bad. So if we're in a relationship and we can't figure out how to get the person to do what we're wanting them to do, it can very often take us into a place of feeling bad about ourselves, not lovable, not worthy, there must be something broken with me that I need this person to do whatever it is that I think he should do or she should do, and I can't make them happen. And that can bring up shame. The psychic protection that we use, that we learn to use as 2-year-olds, is blame. It can't be that I'm bad. It can't be that I'm broken. It must be that he, she, or it is wrong, is defective, is a narcissist, is some other label. I really do think that blame is a function of an inability to know what to do with shame, to know how to heal the shame in ourselves.
Absolutely. I see it the same way, how I was brought up, or the types of things that I have experienced in my own life in terms of what a relationship is, what even dreaming about marriage and all that stuff. All this generic and traditional stuff that girls get like infused into their brains from the very young age is actually very toxic, I believe. Starting from the movies that we watch, the Disney movies that really get that toxic fantasy into the women's brain, particularly because I think women crave connection so much that they get obsessive about it, very obsessive. And that actually creates a type of relationship where the man suffocates on that urge of the woman to feel connected, right? And if her level of trauma is not healed enough, she will suffocate him till the end, right? And I hear both sides and understand very well why nowadays we have such an open and even vicious discussion between men and women, this fight between male and female, and even the development of many men not even wanting a relationship anymore, right? Where they, MGTOW and however these movements are called, where men completely take themselves out of even wanting a relationship, even though I think it is a very natural drive for a man to seek a relationship or to seek to want to be with a woman, right? It seems to be, to me at least, a very natural thing, but nowadays we have this anti-natural movement. And I find it very interesting how you describe this victim mindset, that it is one way of getting the type of love, even it is a very superficial type of love, that they might not have gotten from their parents. That must have been the root cause of it. And I see myself in that so much in all my past life, how I have developed that kind of victim mindset and blaming not only myself and hurting not only myself, but also looking for blame in other things, because that is so much easier, right? That's so much more welcome in our brains to explain things away, because it feels so painful to sit with that type of guilt and shame, right?
Yeah.
It's so uncomfortable. It tears you apart if you don't know how to dissect things, if you don't know how to be self-aware and how to develop techniques, or even seek out mentors and coaches who might be able to help you, right? If you don't know what to do with it, you will crumble inside and you will always seek either self-harm or you will harm other people. And this is why it's so important that we talk about it. In the beginning, in the first answer of my question, you also talked about listening. And this is one major skill. Me as a communication coach, obviously, I learned that. I had to learn that and put listening on a pedestal, because that's the highest skill that a person can develop. And you even call it transformative listening. How does this bridge a significant gap between people, leading to profound transformation in their relationship dynamics?
Before I answer that question, I want to pick up on what you were just saying about that, these wounds, the victim archetype, it's present in all of us. And if we don't understand her function and know how to integrate her, we'll continue to project it out and, create these dramas over and over. You're absolutely right that so many of us, so many people don't know how to heal that or work with that. And at some point, I'd love to come back to the idea of the flaws that I see in psychology and theology. There isn't a framework in those fields, in my opinion, that actually takes us into real healing. So we can pick up that, but that's going to be part of trying to answer this next question of yours. How does healing significantly bridge the gaps, and what does it do? And by the way, I didn't know you were a communication coach. So yay, let's go deeper. It's one of those things where all my life, people have said to me, "Oh, you're such a good listener." And for me, I just felt like, well, doesn't everybody know how to listen? And of course, I realized that not everybody does know how to listen in a way that the other person gets to really feel seen and heard, understood, and appreciated for being who they are. I started observing and deconstructing what I did that would have somebody else say, "Oh my gosh, you're such a good listener." And what I was so delighted to figure out is that I was instinctively following the flow of information in the brain. So I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Dan Siegel's work and his model of the brain. He uses his hand to model one hemisphere of the brain, right? So in this model, the palm of the hand is the brain stem, which is all about fight or flight. The thumb, if you close it in, represents the amygdala and the hippocampus, so the memory and emotion center. And then if you close your fingers over the top of that, those fingers represent the frontal cortex, where our logical thinking happens, right? Well, the fingernails represent the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is where our empathy, our ability to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, our ability to regulate our own emotions and to modulate our own physical responses, it all comes from the prefrontal cortex. And that prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. So we come into the world with our brains not connected, the parts of our brains not connected to each other, right? When we're listening in a transformative way, what we're doing is speaking to each part of the brain in a hierarchical sequence. So we can't jump to logic if somebody is in an emotional state. And we can't even validate and empathize if somebody is terrified and in fight or flight. So transformative listening and the revert formula that I put together speaks to the parts of the brain in the order of low to high functioning. So we start with just simply reflecting the other person through our body language, through the noises that we make, our tone of voice. We match the other person, which calms the brainstem. Then we empathize and validate using their emotional words, not our précis or our paraphrasing, but their emotional words to calm the amygdala and the hippocampus. And then we redirect them to their own creativity and genius by asking questions that get them thinking about the solution to their problem. Now, one of the things that I'm just so delighted to have learned from this hand model from Dr. Dan Siegel is in one of his videos, he says that the one thing that helps stimulate the growth of integrative neurons that connect the prefrontal cortex to all the other parts of the brain, making it easy for information to flow in the brain. In other words, we're growing up the brain. The one thing that stimulates growth of those neurons is the experience of feeling felt, being seen and heard, understood, and appreciated for being who you are. So we're actually growing, we're having an effect on the person's brain at the highest functioning, the highest human functioning center of the brain through skilled or transformative listening.
That is absolutely beautiful. I love how you just explained this. And I hope that people paid really attention, because that explains so much. That first of all, you need to make sure that the person knows that you are not a danger to them, basically, right? Or very simply speaking. Because they might feel initially, they might have a feeling or an unknowing about you, right? If they meet you for the first time, like we met for the first time in this interview, we don't know anything about each other, or at least not much. And we have an initial feeling, is this a person a threat to me, right? In some ways. And I think we think that on a very subconscious level. We're not even aware of it, that this is going on, because maybe because of the history of humanity, where we come from as hunters and gatherers, we always needed to look out for danger, right? So our brains is automatically working on that level. And once we've done that, once we have, just like you beautifully described, communicate that we are not a threat to you by, for example, mirroring the other person, not in a manipulative way, but in a genuine way. I understand you, I feel you, I hear you, right? Obviously, saying those words, it instantly puts them in a very calm state, the brain in a very calm state. And then you can continue, right? Then you can go into the creative state. Then you can start asking questions, even very personal questions, right? That is the skill that certain people have, like Oprah, for example, how people instantly open up to her and even cry in her show, because she has the ability to instantly go through all these levels and arrive at the last level where people completely open up to her, right? And I have a very similar experience ever since I am a child, because I was instinctively doing these things myself without even knowing it, that people would always, in school, I was always kind of the unofficial psychologist for everyone. Everyone was coming to me with their problems. I didn't know why at that time. But now, of course, I understand, because I used all these techniques to make them feel safe and calm and heard and seen and felt, because that's what I never had. And I wanted to be that person for other people. I wanted to make them feel all those things, because that is where a person starts to develop their own genius. This is where I personally ultimately want to go. But this is the purpose of this show, basically.
You're so right. There's a beautiful poem by E.E. Cummings that I actually pulled up on my computer in case there was an opportunity to share it. Do you mind? Can I share it?
Absolutely.
It's actually, it's a poem that I use in my listening labs where I teach communication. E.E. Cummings wrote, "We do not believe in ourselves until someone reveals that deep inside us, something is valuable, worth listening to, worthy of our trust, sacred to our touch. Once we believe in ourselves, we can risk curiosity, wonder, spontaneous delight, and any experience that reveals the human spirit." That is the power of a great listener. That's transformational listening. If we can listen in a way that somebody feels valued, I believe something inside wakes up. Genius emerges, as you said. Something inside starts to heal, and the brilliance of the person comes out. It's making me tear up because I get so inspired by this. That is the power of a transformational listener. And the other piece, I'm so glad you brought up Oprah, because I have to stick a pin in that just a little bit. Because Oprah is brilliant. She's a fantastic listener. And like you said, has the ability to have people cry on her shoulders. As long or until her own judgments get triggered. And this to me is where deep personal development and understanding human behavior from a quantum physics perspective rather than a pop psychology perspective starts to come in. Because I remember watching Oprah, a show years and years ago. And on her show, she had about 6 or 8 different couples, and all of the men had had affairs. And so the whole show was about the poor traumatized wife whose husband had an affair, and how could Oprah and her people help these women heal from the trauma of bad husband. Except for one couple. There was one couple who had done the work. And what the wife said was, my husband's affair was the greatest gift to our marriage. And I felt everything in me lean in, like, oh, I want to hear how they got to that perspective. And there was silence in the room. And then Oprah said, I don't know how you can say that. And she went back to talking to the people, the woman who was still feeling victimized. So being a listener that can have this healing effect or growth producing or genius eliciting effect on other people requires us to do our own work and in my opinion, expand our understanding of human behavior way past what our regular psychology and theology can offer us.
When we have the ability to kind of disconnect ourselves on purpose from what the other person is saying, that we don't have the urge to always feel connected to everything that we find in this world. This enables us to remain in a curious state where we can learn so much instead of remaining in our own limited view and field, where we actually hold ourselves back by not learning from others and not seeing the things that others might see from their perspective. We are limiting ourselves because we don't know how big our genius is. If we wanted to look at it from a very selfish perspective, we are not able to see our own genius unless we recognize the genius in other people, and vice versa, right? And by remaining curious about other people, even if we think this is so contrary to what I believe, how horrendous is this, what she or he is saying right now? This is crippling my brain in this moment. And we have these debates on social media, on podcasts and everywhere, where people with contrary opinions and expertise come together and they fight so viciously against each other. But I think the one crucial ability in a communicator is to remain silent, if you will, graceful and put together, and listen to the other person and understand parts of yourself, why it is triggering you so much, right? And I am still learning this, right? I'm practicing this daily to find that place where I can be a complete medium, if you will, for other people to serve from the highest places of myself, and not project my own limits, if you will, and trauma onto other people. But I personally want to get to the highest places, and I can only recommend all people to do the same, because it opens up, it grows your own genius so much, and so it naturally gives you the ability to lift other people up, other people's geniuses. And let's connect that to the pop psychology and dive deeper into that and see why pop psychology, theology, and positive thinking are not paths for real healing.
So coming from a background of, I have a degree in psychology. I was inspired by Carl Jung's autobiography when I was 14. I read Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And in it, he said, we cannot affect true healing until we reach the soul. So that was the question that inspired me at 14. And the next chunk of my life became a quest to try to answer how do we reach the soul? What is the soul? What does it look like and feel like? What happens when we reach it? And how do I explain all of that to my nuclear physicist father? So I went off to university at Cape Town, and I knew in the first year that no way in heck did I want to be a psychotherapist the way that I was being trained back then. Now, this is late 80s, right? Psychology was trying to prove itself a science. You were depressed because your dopamine levels were off, and the treatment was behavior modification. There was nothing about the prospective, the pulling forward into life of the archetypes and the spiritual aspect of the personality. So that was my start in psychology. The reason that I say psychology and theology cannot provide us paths to true healing is because they are grounded in an either-or framework. Thoughts, according to them, are either positive or negative. Things, personality traits, are either functional or dysfunctional. It's a very either-or. We are set up as human beings to divide things into contrasts. Like for us to have a human experience, we take in all this information from our outside world and we separate it into light and dark, rough and smooth, sweet and sour. All of our senses depend on contrast for us to have a human experience. So there is a part of us that is naturally going to take information and divide it. Every time we have a thought, we are dividing a packet of energy and creating contrast, right? So in order to move forward and create experiences, we're constantly separating the inseparable in order for us to have an experience. Otherwise, we'd be just in a snowstorm, right? So creating requires us to separate the inseparables and have contrast. But to heal, to make whole, we have to have a different way of thinking that takes those separated by our minds, thoughts and feelings, and bring them back together, to religate them. That's the original meaning of the word religion, is to religate, to rejoin the emotional charges that we have separated. Bring one side of the story into consciousness with its other side of the story so that we actually get to God consciousness, grace. Or if you're from a Buddhist perspective, into a moment of emptiness. To go back and sit with a psychologist and tell your story about the trauma in the past, while the psychologist is looking and listening through a lens of, well, that was dysfunctional, or that was bad, or that was painful, the highest place of healing that you can get to with that is a place of indifference. And the path to indifference looks something like, well, that was a bad thing that happened to me back then. But because of my therapy or my meditation or my praying, at some point in the future, I might get to a place where I can say, well, that was a bad thing, but I can see enough good that I can let it go. I can move on. I can forgive you for doing that bad thing back then, right? That is not healing. That is as far as I believe our regular thinking about thinking, and which is very influenced by psychology and theology, comes from. There's another level of awareness that we have to get out, that we can only attain with a different model of understanding consciousness. And this is where quantum physics comes in. In physics, we know that if you take the smallest unit of energy, let's say one of the elementary particles, let's say an electron, and you put it into motion in an accelerated chamber, that one particle of energy appears to divide itself into what look like two separate packets of energy, one with a positive charge, the other with a negative. Now, what they realized at CERN when they spun one particle, it's the other particle increased its spin to the same degree, but in the opposite direction simultaneously. So the realization was that these two apparently separate packets of energy were not separate at all. They were the non-locally connected poles of one packet of energy. So what does this have to do with psychology? If we take that model and apply it to the mind, the model looks something like this. The smallest unit of mental energy is a thought. Every time we take a thought and put it into motion, in other words, we send it into the future, into an imagination, or we send it into the past, into a memory, it must follow that half of that energy will go in the direction that we're sending it with our consciousness, but the other half of that thought packet spirals in the opposite direction. So every time we have a memory of the past, we also create a fantasy of the future. And when we create a fantasy or an imagination for the future, we create a memory of the past. And the mind is doing this all the time. Now, and there's some evidence. Harvard has done some research. There's stuff published in 2016 on the idea of memories and anti-memories, both occurring simultaneously in the brain. So the model goes back to physics. Using magnets, when one particle is forced together, is smashed into its antiparticle. Stephen Hawking wrote, for every particle, there's an antiparticle. And you never want the two to meet because they'll annihilate each other in a blinding flash of light. That's exactly what's happening in the accelerator chambers. Particles and their antiparticles are being smashed together, and massive flashes of light is the result. In the mind, when we ask the intelligent questions that force our story that we're telling into conscious contact with its anti-story, the story and the anti-story literally collapse each other. And what we experience is a blinding flash of enlightenment, a moment of peace. And it's in those moments that we literally heal. There's the story and the anti-story collapse each other. I've seen physiology change in these moments. I've seen relationships shift dramatically, long distance. One person doesn't even know something's happening. And of course, one's sense of self, one's knowing who one is, shifts and grows and expands in those moments as well.
What you said about contrast, while you were explaining the natural inclination of a human being to see things in contrast, my personal belief is that this might not even be a natural thing necessarily, but also a cultural or even an upbringing thing. Because being born in Asia and experience the Asian world, but then again the European world, I notice differences in how people and cultures perceive the world. And especially interesting, the big contrast between Asia and Europe. Right, the contrast between things, in my perception and experience, is in Europe much bigger than it is in Asia. How people try to see things in black and white, for example, and this is also a political agenda. Let's be honest, that people on purpose, and of course an instrument of the media as well nowadays, to create contrast in such painful ways that people feel torn apart, right? That they start fighting, divide and conquer, goes all back to that. But maybe if it is based on a natural inclination of a person to see things in contrast in order to experience as you described it, then nowadays we experience it in such an extreme that it's not natural anymore. And of course, when we are kids, we need that contrast to learn. For example, a very basic example, if a toddler learns to walk and it touches the hot stove, right, it has the contrast, right, from the cold to the hot. The contrast makes the learning possible. If you go into frequencies even, there are differences, there are contrasts even in our senses, how we perceive certain frequencies, which is a fascinating field on itself. But what I want to get at is that when we grow up, or in the process of growing up, I think, and this is deeply connected to healing and true healing, as I understand you describe it, and is only possible when we try to see the contrast we experienced as children and try to grow into a more differentiated view of life. This is not just bad or good, but how can a bad thing also be a good thing? Where are the gray shades, so to speak, of all the good and bad that we have experienced? I think this is where we start to really heal on a deeper level. And this is also where I see a big difference between those cultures, between Asia and Europe, where the striving for seeing things differently, especially in, for example, the Japanese culture, is so different, where the calmness comes from because of also slowing down, doing things with intention, right? Where we take the physical concept of time into our lives and we actually allow things to unfold, because without time you can't see what's in between. Without time, and this is also something that is so brutally forced into the human experience in the Western world especially, is the enormous contrast between having time and having no time, and the enormous pressure with time, right? Having a job, having everything is based on time and on the clock, and you are pressured into not taking time. But I believe only by taking time, you stretch your experience, and then you have the ability to see all the gray area. And this is where the healing takes place, not on the outer edges of black or white.
The part that's really resonating with me of what you just said is that we need to take time to, and I'm just going to use my words here, do the inner work of actually looking and observing our experiences in life. Because if we rush through life, as you say, on the clock, doing all the things that we think we're responsible for doing, and never take time to examine what's happening in the interior, then isn't that what was it Joseph Campbell who said, an unexamined life is not worth living? And we certainly in our culture, and dividing my time between Africa and the States, I mean, it's horrifying to me that there are no holidays in the States. Like, people just work and work and work and work. Whereas, on African time here, and I lived in the Caribbean for a while as well, it's a very different sense of having to get things done and be productive with our time. I want to pick up on one thing that you said, though, just to add this thought to the conversation. There is an adage that says time heals, but it doesn't have to take time to heal. What time does is it gives us time to see things from a different perspective. And it's the different perspective that changes our emotional judgment of the experience that we've been through. But if we know how to ask the right questions, and we have a framework that allows us to bring the story and its anti-story together into a collision in a short period of time, healing can be instant. Healing takes as long as it takes to bring your story and your anti-story into conscious contact with each other. Once they're in conscious contact, which can happen really quickly, if you know what questions to ask, healing is instantaneous.
It's so beautiful that you add that. And it's such an interesting concept to think about time in a physics sense, and in the sense how we experience time, is that it is absolutely relative, just like Einstein described, right? That it does not have to be a long time measured on the clock, which is why I don't believe in the clock per se. It is not a good measure of time, in my opinion. At least not to understand complex concepts of consciousness, of attraction, of healing. I don't think we should measure that in clock time. But as you described, time can be absolutely relative, and it only takes a millisecond of deciding to take the time. And all of a sudden you open up a gap of enormous time frame to actually go into the deeper inner work.
Yes, and I would encourage anyone listening to learn a framework that makes taking that time actually take you somewhere. As opposed to, right before we came on here, I was feeling a little anxious and excited about this, and I decided to go and ground outside. And I know myself very often, if I'm anxious, I will tend to just ruminate, like working on, want to make sure I get it right. Yeah. But when I went outside onto the lawn, there was a snail, a huge snail. Well, I thought he was pretty big, who absolutely captivated my attention. And all of a sudden, 10 minutes were gone. And I had been so focused on this beautiful creature and this lovely undulation of its body with its little feelers working its way through the grass, that was so healing. Like there was something, it was healing to have my mind taken somewhere else rather than spending that time ruminating and continuing to think the same thought. So I think we need things that make us think differently in order to accelerate or amplify the healing that we're giving ourselves time to do.
Transforming conflict into connection is quite an idealistic goal, and some may argue that certain conflicts are irreparable and should not be transformed. How do you respond to that?
There's a very big lie that we tell ourselves about relationships. And that lie is that we have relationships with other people. We don't. We never have relationships with other people. We have relationships with the stories that we're telling ourselves about those people. So every relationship is a reflection of the relationship we're having with ourselves. So the idea of transforming conflict, is it a good idea? I believe it is, because as I've worked my way through conflicts, I've always learned something about me, and it's been healing for me. So it's a thoroughly selfish thing to do, to attempt to transform conflict into connection. At a deeper level, yes, it's always wise, I think, to take a look at conflicts. Now, can they always be resolved? And I think the question here really is, or the assumption here is, if I resolve a conflict, go from conflict to connection, it means I'm going to be good friends with the person I just had a conflict with. Okay, and I don't believe that that is always the case, nor should it be an aspiration. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Remember, if we go back to the two roots of conflict, first root of conflict is priorities in life. And you can resolve that kind of conflict through communication that helps you identify your highest priorities, which is always a good thing, because your purpose in life is connected to your priorities. Your purpose in life is to fulfill your highest priorities in the most efficient way possible. So conflict can very often help us to see our own authentic priorities when our false ego may actually be blocking us from knowing what our true priorities are. So conflict can be a beautiful clarifier of our own internal conflict. Now, you can get clear on your priorities. You can get clear on the other person's priorities. You can figure out how to have a conversation that heals the gap between the two of you so that you feel understood, he feels understood, or she, and you can appreciate each other, right? If there's enough of an overlap of your priorities and the other person's priorities, you're going to want to stay friends with them. Because we want to stay friends with the people who we think support our priorities more than challenge them. Now, you may decide that your priorities are this collection of things, and their priorities are that, and there's not a whole lot of connection between the two of you. You don't want to spend your space-time, energy, money doing what they're doing with their space-time, energy, and money. In which case, you can amicably separate and go your own ways. Now, without this framework, what tends to happen that I see a lot in relationship is, here's one person's hierarchy of priorities, here's the others. They're in a power struggle trying to make the other one value what we think they should value and prioritize. And when they don't know how to sell and they don't know how to appreciate the person for being who they are, anger, frustration, resentment builds up. And then we go into shaming and blaming the other person, right? So it's shaming and blaming come from not understanding the benefits of conflict to yourself. So I always think it's wise to take a look at what's going on in a conflict and decide, what is this showing me about my particular priorities, which is going to lead to purpose in life. It can also show you the parts of you that you haven't yet loved because you haven't understood their function. So again, it's worth taking time to really get clear on the benefits of the conflict, because what you're going to find are the parts of yourself that are waiting to be integrated, which is only going to make you a more whole, integrated, self-loving, self-aware person, which will make you a better leader, a better lover, a better parent, a better partner.
Because most of the time when we experience this kind of feeling that we are selfish, not good, and that we fail on so many different levels, we ban parts of ourselves, right? We don't allow these parts of ourselves to even live on the same plane or in the same body that we want to live in. And what we create in the end, if we see the body as the temple, what we create is kind of like a wasteland. Most of our body turns into a wasteland because we abandon parts of ourselves. And most of the people that I experience in life are only living in their heads, very much in their heads. And they are abandoning their bodies for the most part, mostly because we experience emotions in a bodily sense, right? This is the biggest part of our body, right? We do process emotions in our brains, but still we feel it in our bodies. So we abandon our bodies a lot. And I think this also comes from the notion or idea how we are being raised, because parents oftentimes tend to tell kids, for example, you should not be selfish, right? You should be doing X, Y, Z, right? You should be serving, you should be sharing, which is a concept I never understood as a mom when I raised my kids, right? So out of the universe, so to speak, to share with strangers that you don't even know or trust, right? Which goes back to the brain that you described in the beginning. And I think it makes us abandon parts of our bodies, even starting from childhood again, childhood traumas that we carry into our adult life. And the way you described it just now made me realize that selfishness is actually good, in the sense that if you are a good person, being selfish would mean, if the traits of your personality, for example, is service, empathy, understanding, listening, helping other people grow, by me being selfish, if that's my character, I do the world a big service, right? And this is something that is not described in this way, right? We are always encouraged to not being selfish. We are always encouraged dismantling the parts of our bodies and abandoning them. By, again, we are dividing our bodies, and then someone else conquers our bodies and minds by brainwashing us with ideas that are so anti-natural living and healing.
I'm very kinesthetic, and I haven't done this in a long time, but I used to be able to put my hands on people and feel what was happening in their bodies. And I could feel the relationship challenges that were manifesting as disease. And one of the things that I realized was that from a metaphysical perspective, underneath every physical ailment, there is a relationship issue. And underneath every relationship issue is a self-awareness, self-love issue. So you're absolutely right that these as we become sort of narrow in our beliefs about how we should be and how we shouldn't be, we emphasize certain parts of ourselves and deny the other parts. We do create physiology that reflects those expansions and contractions within ourselves. So you're absolutely right. I do want to put this, though, in the context of wisdom, right? If something is happening, it must be happening for a reason. And Nietzsche, the philosopher, said that there were 3 phases of life, right? The first was the youth. And in the first phase of life, it's all about being a sponge and absorbing all the rules about who we're supposed to be, how life works, how we should show up, what we should do, not do, etc., etc. That's the first part of life. The second part of life is the adult, where the function of the adult is to go out and slay the dragon. And the dragon is this great beast covered in scales, and on every scale is the word should. So the middle part of life is about killing the dragon, is about facing the shoulds and reclaiming ourselves. The third part of life, when the dragon is slain, what emerges from within the dragon is the child. And the child is the being who lives spontaneously for their own delight, living in accordance with their highest priorities, their authentic values, on purpose, aligning everything that they're doing with their conscious purpose, playing with life, dancing with life. And I love that it's the child that emerges third, not first. Like we think of it in our culture, like anyway, you know what I'm trying to say. So there is a function. We set with the first half of life is about splitting ourselves, creating the shadow and the mask, setting up the conditions for the traumas that will potentially create the impetus for us to go within in the second part of life, slay the dragon, free ourselves from all the shoulds in order to emerge and live as the child, spontaneous, connected to our authentic selves.
And coming to the realization that it is not a should, but it should be transformed into I want and I need, right? Realizing what that is, the difference, right? Between what I should, or yes, I love, I want, I need, right? And it's so interesting how you describe it, that maybe we remain our whole lives the child, but only through that type of slaying the dragon, the healed child reemerges, that finally, hopefully, finds the freedom to express himself and herself in the most brilliant ways, how she was actually meant to express herself or himself. And maybe you can connect that to the hermetic principles that you found most beneficial, maybe in understanding relationships and why people do what they do, and what specific principles you apply to your work.
So as much as I can be a bit disparaging about theology and some of the pop psychologies, the truth is that the wisdom that I'm talking about is there. You know, I'm not making this. I didn't come up. I'm not an original creator of these ideas. These teachings are there in all of the great philosophical traditions and the spiritual traditions. I just think that they've been very shallowly understood in our Western culture. And I can't speak to the Eastern culture because I've never lived there. But in our Western culture, I think they've been either misunderstood or very superficially understood. So the teachings of Hermes, the Hermetic principles, principle number 1 is that everything is mental, right? This is, if we get nothing else, this is the principle that everything is a mind game, that there is nothing but consciousness. And all matter, the second Hermetic principle, all matter arises through what we expect. And we know this from physics, that, you know, when Niels Bohr and company were trying to decide if light was either a wave or a particle, They set up photoelectric experiments, the double slit experiment, and realized that light showed up as either a particle or a wave, depending on the expectation of the observer. So this is an extraordinary principle. And if we think about relationships, we're all looking at everybody else with expectations of how they're going to act, right? So the second hermetic principle, the principle of correspondence, says what as above, so below is another way to express it. In relationship, as out there, so in your head. If you're expecting your husband or your partner or your child or your employee to show up in a certain way, that's what you're going to see. And that's the relationship. You're going to react to what you just saw, and the relationship will follow what your expectations were. It's like my mother used to say to me, if you expect a child to be stupid, the child is going to be stupid. Right? So those are just the first two hermetic principles. The fourth hermetic principle is the principle of duality, right? Which, we've talked about the model from quantum physics. You take a packet of energy, it creates a particle and antiparticle that occurs simultaneously. That is the key word. In the mind, we create a positive and a negative emotion simultaneously, and then react to whichever half of the story we consciously focus on, and create a drama out of half the story, ignoring the other half of the story. And then there's another hermetic principle, I can't remember which one it is now, but the principle of oscillation or vibration, that everything it's the principle of rhythm, that how that plays out in a relationship is when you first meet somebody and you perceive that they support your priorities more than challenge them, you're going to see all the good stuff, and you're going to go up into elation, right? And you're going to want to be with them, and you're going to get infatuated, and you're going to think that they're just fantastic, all good, no bad people, right? And then over time, the other side starts to show up, where you think they're so generous. You're going to have experiences over time where you think, my God, they're so stingy. You're going to think, they're so kind. And then you're going to see a side of them that's like, oh my gosh, that was a cruel thing to do, right? Because from physics, we're holographic. We have every trait. There's no such thing as a good human being and a bad human being. We're all human beings with every single trait. And you and I are judging each other through the lens of our priority systems. We see what we expect to see, and we like each other if we think we see more similarities, and we dislike each other if we think we see more dissimilarities. We're the ones projecting our whole story and of expectation onto somebody else, and then forgetting that we were actually the one projecting it. We go into amnesia, and we react to the other person as though they're actually the thing that we decided that they were. So working with my clients with these principles, and the reason that I love this work so much is the end result is freedom. Oh my gosh, freedom to just be who you are, freedom to let the other person be who they are, and then have these delightful dances with each other. Like, let's get conscious about the dramas we're choosing to create, and let's create dramas that feel more like dances.
Yes, and it correlates so beautifully to the quantum superpositions that you just described, right? Where an object or a microscopic object or the electron or what have you can exist in both two almost opposite states, if you will. There was an experiment done, or thought experiment at least, with the cat being in a box. I don't know if you heard of that experiment.
Yes.
So basically, I will explain for the audience who don't know that experiment. I find that so interesting that if you imagine a sealed box containing a live cat and a vial of poison, a Geiger counter, a radioactive atom and a hammer. The radioactive atom has a 50% chance of decaying within a specific time frame. Inside the box, there is a quantum system, such as an atom, that undergoes radioactive decay. If the Geiger counter detects a decay event, the hammer is triggered, breaking the vial of poison and causing harm to the cat. Now, if no decay is detected, the cat remains unharmed. Now, here's the interesting part. According to the principles of quantum mechanics, until the box is opened, just exactly what you described with consciousness, and the system is actually observed, the quantum system exists in a superposition of two states, decayed and not decayed. And this implies that the cat is in a superposition of being both alive and dead. Now, here comes the observation, right? The key point of this experiment is that the cat's fate is linked to the quantum system. And only when someone opens the box and observes the state of the quantum system does the superposition collapse in either one of the states, right? Either alive or dead. So this also says so much about how much influence our consciousness has on the outcomes of everything that we experience in life. And I can imagine that you use the revert process to heighten the ability of people who experience relationship problems to actually heal their relationships, and as you described it, as a dance, to come into that freedom, to experience that type of lightness almost, and seeing things maybe even with humor, right, with time, and that you can observe with couples that have lived like for decades together, right, working through difficult times, that they can see certain things with such lightness and humor that they dance or start to dance mentally with each other.
The revert process, which if anybody wants a download of that, they can just go to my website, and there's a free download on the website of the revert process. That's a process specifically for communication. What to say, when to say it, how to say it, in order to calm the brain, as we talked about. In order to be that kind of transformative listener requires two things. The skill, the what to do, which is the revert process. And then there's the who to be. That's where the deep personal work comes in, of really getting to know oneself, to love oneself in all one's manifestations, and then show up authentically and be oneself. Now, that's much deeper work. There is a process that I call Activate Grace, which is the process for taking a story, identifying, like really getting clear on the story that you're telling, and then figuring out how to bring the anti-story into consciousness in a way that collapses both and takes you into moments of grace. It's actually a process that I used without knowing I was using a process. It's a thing I did when I found a tumor in my breast. And I was 3 years into studying this quantum physics model of consciousness. And I completely forgot everything that I was learning because I was so terrified when I found this tumor. My mother died of breast cancer. Her mother died of breast cancer. So when I found this tumor, I thought, well, I'm just following in their footsteps. So for 6 days, I did all the old stuff, positive thinking, trying not to give it negative energy, affirmations, all the rest of it. And then on the 7th day, I lost it. I couldn't keep myself together. And that's when I remembered, you cannot have a terror without a fantasy of something positive. You can't have a negative in your mind without a simultaneous positive going on. You cannot perceive a loss without also perceiving gain. And they're happening at the same time. You're just unconscious of half of the story. So remembering that, instead of trying to turn away from my terror and get out of my terror with all the positive thinking, which I am so clear that it is not a healing modality, I turned towards the horror and sank in. And it took me 3 hours of, if you imagine a yin and yang symbol, it took me 3 hours of fully excavating the dark or the negative, the fear side, and then coming up the other side of the quantum, bringing all of the anti-story out into consciousness. It took me 3 hours. And in 3 hours, I brought myself into a state of grace where to this tumor, I had nothing but gratitude. I had tears streaming down my face going, oh my God, I am so grateful for this tumor that it doesn't matter what comes back with the biopsy. I'm so grateful for this. I wouldn't change a thing. And this is the paradox of healing. The most powerful place from which to bring about change is from a place of wanting no change at all. When you can see how something is serving you and that your heart opens in grace and gratitude for what is, you magically become fully empowered to change the thing, right? So sure enough, this tumor disappeared within 3 months. So the revert process is really the process of listening that follows the flow of information in the brain. And then there is the activate grace process, which is a much deeper process. You have to understand how to identify authentic priorities and purpose. You have to understand the 7 areas of life. We go into the hermetic principles because they underlie all of this. And then it's a matter of learning to master how to collapse the story with the anti-story, bring yourself into a state of grace. And the more we can do that with ourselves, the more present we can be with the people around us. And again, it makes for better leadership, better parenting, better partnership, and freedom to let each other be ourselves.
What I feel from the story that you just told is that the why is it that when we collapse into gratitude and acceptance of both the story and the anti-story, if we uncover the wholeness of it, why is it only in gratitude and in acceptance? And I think the reason for that is because the most natural state is healing. When we observe the body or the innate capacity of how the body is actually biologically functioning, it is constantly in an effort to heal everything that is not healed just yet, right? On a pure physical realm, so to speak, if you cut your finger, the body rushes in and tries to repair it. The same with the mind. I think this is the underlying principle, natural principle that we all experience. And unless we interfere with that basic principle, we will not find healing. So if we interfere with our story, if we don't find the story, if we don't realize what story it actually is that we are telling ourselves, right, about ourselves and about the partner or about the world, if we don't uncover the anti-story, if we only think there's one story, my truth, right, there's only one truth, right, and it's true what I feel and untrue what you feel, right, if we only do that, we will not find healing on any level. If we don't uncover the anti-story, there will be no healing. If we don't collapse into gratitude and understanding of what is actually going on and why it is going on, we will not allow the body to do its natural duty, if you will, the natural process of healing. And I forget it all the time, even though I am aware of this principle. I tend to collapse into fear, into terror, into projecting horror stories into the future, right? This is like what humans do on a daily basis. But actually, if you take yourself back, you remind yourself of that basic, rudimentary principle of healing, that your body will always try to heal you on every level. Just allow it by being aware of this principle, right? And this process.
Yeah, the body is it's an extraordinary creation with so much healing power. And it's also a feedback mechanism, isn't it? You know, if we get lopsided, if we get very rigid, believing that our story is the only story, our body is going to create something that is going to reflect rigidity in us to try to wake us up to we're being too rigid. There's another side of the story. And once we get the message, then the body is free to heal itself.
Yeah, that's also goes back to what is so dominant in the Eastern culture of letting go, right? All the meditation that has swept over to the West is actually all about acceptance, gratitude, and letting go of especially the material and outcomes, expectations, and stuff like that. And just being in yourself, accepting all the natural processes that you go through as a human being. It's all about just letting go and let the nature do what it does best, heal.
We need the striving and the forward motion of wanting and creating. And we need the love and gratitude for what is. We need both sides.
I think you also wanted to go into a client story.
This client who reached out to me, he was the COO, I think, of a major corporation here in Africa. But he reached out to me because he and his wife had separated. And his children were so upset with him that they cut him out of their lives. They refused to talk to him. And he was so thrown by that, because he felt that if he wasn't happy in his marriage, then his wife couldn't be happy either, and the kids would understand, is what he thought. Well, they didn't understand. And he was so devastated by their reaction, and their apparent hatred of him, that he was overwhelmed emotionally to the point that he couldn't function at work. So he ended up taking a sabbatical from work and reaching out to me to help him manage his emotions and figure out how to communicate with his family members to get himself seen and heard, understood, and appreciated. So we spent about 3 months working together, and we did a lot of role playing, and I taught him the revert process. And in that 3-month period, he did significant repair with the children to where they were having dinner together. His wife was at least amicable. Well, she was at least not venomous with him, let's put it that way. So there was some communication happening there, but his main concern were the kids, and those relationships were on their way to being repaired, and he was feeling like he was getting heard, and he was developing the ability to hear them without becoming so defensive. So that was most of the work, was how could he manage his emotions and stay in communication with them in a way that got them feeling seen and heard, understood, and appreciated. So I loved the transformation that was happening in his family. But here's the piece that I just was so excited. This was an unexpected bonus. He went back to work after his 3-month sabbatical. And while he'd been away, his company had gone into strike negotiations. They'd been going for 11 weeks, and the negotiations were going nowhere. So on his first day back, he was asked if he wouldn't mind going into the negotiation room and seeing if he could bring people to the table somehow. Well, I didn't know that was happening, but I got a phone call from him on Friday. He was literally, I could hear the tears in his voice. And he said, I just want to let you know that in 5 days, I brought this stalled negotiation to a resolution by doing what you taught me how to do, making everybody feel seen and heard, understood, and appreciated for where they were coming from. Then 4 days, he had everybody back together. And on the Thursday night, they made a deal. 7,000 workers were about to go on strike. He saved his company millions. Not only did he save them millions, but his CEO was whoever the big people were, the board, I guess, they promoted him to CEO of the company. And within that company, the first thing he did as CEO was he started to change the culture within the company to one of listening. He moved managers down from their lovely suites on the top floor onto the same levels as their direct reports. He opened up every Tuesday morning was coffee time with him. Anybody in the company could come and sit with him and have conversation. They started doing Zoom meetings on a regular basis where anybody in the company could join in and hear what was happening. So he not only did he heal the relationships within the family, he also resolved the strike, saved the company millions, got promoted to CEO, and changed the culture within this entire company. And I'm so delighted by the power of this work of not only learning to really listen, but also doing the work of becoming a whole person that can hold all that energy, can be present. So it gives me great hope for the future. Every time somebody shows up to learn and do this work with me, it gives me hope for their family, for their community, for their employees, for their customers, for everybody that they come into contact with.
You need a bigger stage for all of this. I love this. Where can people
Working on
find
it.
you to start that type of work?
The easiest way is just my website, which is simply my name. I'm very simple, really. Like human behavior to me is very simple. My name, jolinakaren.com. People can just email me and we'll set up a time to have a conversation. I'd love to hear what people want to work on, and if we're a good fit to work together, then we go from there.
Awesome. Of course, I leave all the links in the description below for anyone to reach out to you. Thank you so much. I do have so many more
Thank you.
questions. You are such a delight to talk to. It's been a brilliant time listening to you and learning from you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. This has been a delight. Thank you.